So let's continue reading the last two chapters of this book, Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. So chapter 11, Who Stole the Tarts? The King and the Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled about them. All sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them, in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him, and near the king was the white rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table, with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. I wish they would get the trial done, she thought, and hand around the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began looking at everything about her to pass away the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. That's the judge, she said to herself, because of its great wig. The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore his crown over the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. And that's the jury box, thought Alice, and those 12 preachers. Some of them were animals, and some were birds. She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it. For she thought, and rightly too, that very few little girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. The 12 girls were all writing very busily on slates. What are they doing? Alice whispered to the Griffin. They can't have anything to put down yet before the trial's begun. They're putting down their names, the Griffin whispered in reply, for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial. Stupid things, Alice began in a loud, indignant voice, but she stopped herself hastily, for the white rabbit cried out, Silence in the court! And the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously around to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulder, that all the girls were writing down stupid things on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. A nice muddle their slates I'll be in before the trial's over, thought Alice. Of course. One of the girls had a pencil that squeaked. This Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity of taking it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little girl, it was Bill, the lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it. So after hunting all about it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate. Harold, read the accusation, said the king. On this, the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll, and read as follows. The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away. Consider your verdict, the king said to the jury. Not yet, not yet, the rabbit hastily interrupted. There's a great deal to come before that. Call the first witness, said the king, and the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and called out, First witness. The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. I beg pardon, Your Majesty, he began, for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for. You ought to have finished, said the king. When did you begin? The Hatter looked at the March Hare, who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse, 14th of March, I think it was, he said. 15th, said the March Hare. 16th, added the Dormouse. Write that down, the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates, and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. Take off your hat, the king said to the Hatter. It isn't mine, said the Hatter. Stolen, the king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. I keep them to sell, the Hatter added as an explanation. I have none of my own. I'm a Hatter. Here, the queen put on her spectacle and began staring hard at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. Give your evidence, said the king, and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot. This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen. In his confusion, he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment, Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was she was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court. But on second thought, she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her. I wish you wouldn't squeeze so, said the Dormouse, who was sitting next to her. I can hardly breathe. I can't help it, said Alice very meekly. I'm growing. You've got no right to grow here, said the Dormouse. Don't talk nonsense, said Alice more boldly. You know you're growing too. Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace, said the Dormouse, not in that ridiculous fashion. And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. At this time, the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she said to one of the officers of the court, Bring me the list of the singers in the last concert, on which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook both his shoes off. Give your evidence, the king repeated angrily, or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not. I'm a poor man, your majesty, the Hatter began in a trembling voice. And I hadn't begun my tea, not above a week or so, and what with the bread and butter getting so thin, and the twinkling of the tea. The twinkling of what? Said the king. I'm a poor man, the Hatter went on, and most things twinkled after that. Only the March Hare said, I didn't. The March Hare interrupted in a great hurry. You did, said the Hatter. I deny it, said the March Hare. He denies it, said the king. Leave out that part. Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said. The Hatter went on, looking anxiously around to see if he would deny it too. But the Dormouse denied nothing, being fast asleep. After that, continued the Hatter, I cut some more bread and butter. But what did the Dormouse say? One of the jury asked. That I can't remember, said the Hatter. You must remember, remarked the king, or I'll have you executed. The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee. I'm a poor man, your majesty, he began. You're a very poor speaker, said the king. Here, while the guinea pig cheered and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. If that's all you know about it, you may stand down, continued the king. I can't go no lower, said the Hatter. I'm on the floor as it is. Then you may sit down, the king replied. Here the other guinea pig cheered and was suppressed. Come, that finishes the guinea pigs, thought Alice. Now we shall get on better. I'd rather finish my tea, said the Hatter, with an anxious look at the queen, who was reading at the list of singers. You may go, said the king, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court, without even waiting to put his shoes on, and just take his head up outside. The queen added to one of the officers, but the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. Call the next witness, said the king. The next witness was the Duchess cook. She earned the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was, even before she got into the court. By the way, people near the door began sneezing all at once. Give your evidence, said the king. Shan't, said the cook. The queen looked anxiously at the white rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness. Well, if I must, I must, the king said with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a deep voice, What are tarts made of? Pepper mostly, said the cook. Treacle, said a sleepy voice behind her. Collar that dormouse, the queen shrieked out. Behead that dormouse. Turn that dormouse out of the court. Suppress him. Pinch him. Off with his whiskers. For some minutes, the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. Never mind, said the king with an air of great relief. Call the next witness. And he added in an undertone to the queen, Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache. Alice watched the white rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like, for they haven't got much evidence yet. She said to herself, Imagine her surprise when the white rabbit read out, at the top of his shrill little voice, the name Alice. So let's begin chapter 12, called Alice Evidence. Here, cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes. She tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurymen on to the heads of the crowd below. And when they lay sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of the goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. Oh, I beg your pardon. She began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back in the jury box, or they would die. The trial cannot proceed, said the king in a very grave voice, until all the jurymen are back in their proper places. Oh, he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he'd said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard and head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a weird way, being quite unable to move. She soon got it out again, and put it right. Not that it signifies much, she said to herself. I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other. As soon as the jury had a little recovered from their shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the accident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything, but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. What do you know about this business? The king said to Alice. Nothing, said Alice. Nothing whatever? Persisted the king. The king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, called out silence and read out from his book. Rule 42. All person more than a mile high to leave the court. Everybody looked at Alice. I'm not a mile high, said Alice. You are, said the king. Nearly 2 miles high, added the queen. Well, I shall not go at any rate, said Alice. Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now. It's the oldest rule in the book, said the queen. Then it ought to be number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his notebook hastily. Consider your verdict, he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first. Hold your tongue, Guy, said the queen, turning to purple. I won't, said Alice. Off with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. Who cares for you? Said Alice. She had grown to a full size by this time. You're nothing but a pack of cards. At this, The whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister. "Wake up, Alice, dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember them. Her sister kissed and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly, but now run into your tea. It's getting late." So Alice got off and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well as she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still just as she left her, leaning her head on her hand, watching the setting sun, and thinking of the little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she began dreaming after a fashion. She pictures to herself how the same little sisters of hers would, in the after time, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep, through all her ripper years, the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows, and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. The end. So yeah, what a lovely little story, and hopefully I'll see you in another classic story. Bye.